All right, let's get to it. So, what's up, y'all? What's up? What's up? We want to talk about strategic planning, and I want to share with you really the components of a strategic plan, what makes a great strategic plan, how I structure the meetings around progressing a strategic plan, so the difference between planning and execution. And in those meetings, there's three questions that I like to have answered in any of our meetings. So we don't have marathons. We're not sitting going around circles. We're actually getting some work done in more of a working session. So let's get right to it. So, what is a strategic plan, right? A strategic plan simply is a roadmap on how you're going to advance. In this case, we're talking about business, right? So, from a business company perspective, it is a roadmap that allows you and any other stakeholders in your business, that's your staff, that's your vendors, that's the community, that's your investor team, whoever that is, it gives a roadmap as to the direction in which you are going. It outlines the tactics and strategies to get there, and it answers those questions of the how, when, why, what, um, especially. So that's essentially what you're looking at with a strategic plan, right? And so it's documented that it's not designed to be a cup holder, right? It's designed for you to go and then help guide your execution and make sure that you keep the main thing is what we want to say. So I'm going to go through sort of our strategic plan at River City Capital that I've recently designed, and we're going to see if it meets the criteria of a good strategic plan, right? Um, so what makes a good strategic plan, right? One, it has to be truthful about the sort of the current realities, right? Where are you weak? Where are you strong? What's changing? What's working, right? So we had our staff retreat a couple of days ago, and those are the things that we started out discussing, honestly, with our team, and we had a couple of vendors there. So those are the things you're looking at. Clarity in your thesis, right? What's sort of the central idea or belief guiding what's to come, right? So we'll get into that a little bit. You'll see this here in the document here. Identify your priorities, right? So when you talk about keeping the main thing, what matters most right now? What must be improved? What must be protected? What must be built? What must be changed? Right? Either we're going to keep doing what we've been doing, or we're going to stop doing something we've been doing, or start doing something new. Right? What is that? Or a combination of those. Um, you want to connect the strategy to your resources. We'll talk about that when we get to the meeting structure, right? What people, what money, what systems, what partnerships are required to reach the goal. And then you want to translate it into action, right? How will this plan show up as who owns it? How does it show up in meetings? How does it show up in timelines? How does it show up in measurable results, right? So let's sort of go through here. We'll get started. So this is for our fiscal year. River City Capital starts yesterday, um, July 1st. It goes through June 30th of 2027. So we're in our fiscal year 2027, right? So it starts out with sort of our thesis, right? Who are we as River City Capital as a certified community development financial institution or CDFI based here in Memphis? What are we looking to do, right? We want to have a deployment strategy of capital. We want to have the operational ability to convert capital into loans. We want to provide technical assistance. We want to have good portfolio performance, and we want to have impact, right? So remember, when I talked about just a minute ago, what makes a good or a great strategic plan, right? And one of those things is, telling the truth about the current reality, right? So I have information here on our financial position, right? So this is as of May 31st from our controller. You can see about 7.6 million in total assets, 4.3 in cash, 1.2 in grants receivable, and about 2 million in loans receivable, right? Um, we also have, as far as 4.3 in total net assets, right? And then about 2.2 in net assets with donor restriction, right? And you can see what those restrictions are sort of tied to. One of the things that came about in this past fiscal year for us is we had about just around $1 million so far. We got another month for June to cover, right? But we had 373,000 total revenue. about 1 million in expenses. So our net assets actually declined 627,000, right? The driver of that is we wrote off 400, but roughly about 437,000 some change, but you ran to 438 in bad debt expense. So those are loans that went bad. We couldn't collect on them, and we had to write those off against our reserve, right? But when you adjust that, right, we had a cash operating deficit of about 178,000. If you add June in, that'll probably be somewhere around the $200,000 mark, maybe a little bit over, right? Um, so what it tells us is there's balance sheet strength, right? But here's some areas that we have to work on, right? And it talks about a blurb here about we're not financially weak by any stretch, right? But we have to improve some areas, right? Certainly in earned revenue, some of these areas to cover that gap that I just mentioned. It's a one-time thing. You have to write it off. It's an accounting piece, right? But it still drove up our total expense, right? I mean, damn near half of our expenses this year was just in writing off bad debt, right? So those are things that we're looking at as a priority. All right, so let's think about lending focus, right? And if you think about, we'll get to some operational priorities and things of that nature here in just a minute. But if you think about, okay, where do we want to focus, right? We typically focus on small business owners, typically Black business owners, Black men and Black women here in Memphis and then beyond. We'll talk about that too, with $1 million or less in annual revenues that already have motion, right? So one of the things where we've ran into some issues on our end financially is where we're providing capital in people in that idealization stage, right? They're pre-revenue, they're really purely startup. There's no operational history. And in many cases, they haven't always shown the readiness for utilizing loan capital, leverage it for growth, right? Um, and so that does not mean, and you can see it underwritten here, doesn't mean we're not supporting early stage entrepreneurs. It means that we have to really sort of delineate how we're going to assist people, right? So early stage entrepreneurs who need a little bit more incubation, need a little bit more support, a little bit more hand holding in developing their business and doing some customer discovery, things of that nature, really rounding out the business infrastructure. That's sort of one lane. And then you have businesses that are ready that have been able to prove that their model works and things of that nature, and they're ready for capital to be able to leverage it, right? And so you can see what I've got highlighted there. Um, Businesses that have the ability to repay, need flexible capital to grow, hire, do all those different things is where we want to focus. So then how do we do that, right? We're not going to simply wait for applicants to come to us. We're going to go to them, right? And so that's what I've engaged and charged our team with this fiscal year is they need to be out much more, spending time in some of the business communities to ensure one, they're aware of us, and businesses that have motion, they're busy running the business, right? They're not busy looking for cohorts and looking for different things like that. They're busy running the business. And so you have to go to them and be a resource to understand where their business is and sort of what the needs are, right? So you can see what the focuses are. I'm not going to read those through. And then you can see in our plan, we have a sort of a lending thesis, right? That sort of summarizes what I just mentioned. All right. So then our targeting strategy. So our targeting strategy is what I just was alluding to, right? Um, Many of these businesses, they're busy running the business, right? They're serving customers, they're managing staff, they're handling cash flow, things of that nature. And so we have to be able to go to those folks that are in some of the more challenged areas, right? And so you can see we have an actual borrower profile here. Um, and then you've got some key referral partners, right? CPAs, accountants, some of our bank partners, some of our local CDCs, some of the entrepreneurial hubs, things of that nature, real estate brokers, some of those folks who work with small businesses that are, they still may be young, but again, they've proven some level of motion. That's what we're focused on, right? So you think about that in terms of going back to what I said, what makes a great strategic plan, right? Is how you're going to prioritize various areas. And we'll get to some of those operating priorities here shortly, right? Technical assistance. So we're looking to add a new software platform. This is going to be the first stage. Then I'm going to hire a technical assistance coordinator, probably either later in the fiscal year or maybe at the beginning of 2028. Once we're able to fill in some of the gap I mentioned earlier in operating, right, from the loan loss. So Initiate is a platform. I'm not going to go into all the details of it, but it is a platform that we are going to incorporate. And what it does, it provides some tools, some templates, some learning modules, things like that, to help people sort of strengthen their business. And we're thinking about this through the entire sort of business journey, right? Prior to them needing capital, right? That early stage, that prove stage, through the underwriting phase when it is identified that a capital injection can be a benefit to growth. And then, very important, after, right? So once a business owner receives capital, then what, right? And how we're continuing to help assist that business owner or business owners in growing the business, right? So Initiate's going to allow us to track that engagement. It's going to allow us to really monitor the progress and really connect that technical assistance development to loan readiness and then loan performance, which we'll get to in a second here too, right? When we talk about managing our portfolio, part of what can help us alleviate from having to write off so many loans is when we have the development tied to the loan, right? They're not mutually exclusive, right? So that's what Initiate's going to do. I think it runs us about 20,000 a year, somewhere in there for the premium service, which gives us unlimited um, accounts and all that type of thing, unlimited users. So I think that's going to be sort of the best fit for us, right? All right. Now let's talk a little bit about fundraising approach, right? Because again, we're going to get closer to goals, and I'm going to skip ahead just for the sake of time to get closer to how the plan helps direct goals, right? Because you got to get eventually to the action, right? And so the capital fundraising approach, one of the things that I've identified for me as a opportunity, right, is how I approach our investors, right? And what is the actual sort of thesis around that? And how do I better position River City Capital as an investment partner for those that care about putting capital in areas that have been underestimated and systemically disinvested, right? And so I've got a whole nother document on this that I'm not going to pull up right now. This is just embedded in our strategic plan, but I have a whole nother document that speaks to some of the tactics and some of the things that we'll do. But three areas that we want to focus on, right? Obviously, lending capital capacity, loan loss reserve, or credit enhancement, right? So credit enhancement grants, which are really centered around some of the ancillary areas around credit, right? And then what I'm calling deployment infrastructure support. So rather than just speak to operations, right? So that an investor doesn't get the idea that we just want capital just purely for paying bills and expenses and salary benefit. But deployment infrastructure support supports number one here, right? Well, and number two, to be honest with you. But number three supports the other two, right? And investors understand that you got to be able to support underwriting, you got to be able to support the servicing of loans, technical assistance I just mentioned, and the compliance reporting, right? And so those are the areas that we're going to be really focused on, right? And so we'll get to, let me jump down here to the goals real quick, right? What do we want to do in terms of a goal, right? So our goal this fiscal year, from a capital perspective, is $4 million in closed commitments, right? And that breaks down, right? Because again, you're talking about clear goals, what must be accomplished, right? And then how you're going to measure it, which we'll get to. So $4 million goal, that is based on 2.5 million for lending capital, right? And my other document speaks to how we want to structure it and all those type of things. 750,000 in loan loss reserve, which makes that's roughly about 30% of that 2.5 million. That's a little bit higher, but we want to make sure it aligns with the risk that we're taking, right? When you're dealing with some more early stage businesses and things of that nature, even businesses that have motion but are not quite yet bankable, right? So that also helps protect the balance sheet and the portfolio. 500,000 in deployment infrastructure support, what I mentioned earlier. And then something else we want to get into, which I've got, again, part of that other document in terms of earned revenue growth. And you'll see that as an operational priority. 250,000 in fund management or earned revenue growth, right? So this is opportunities for us to be able to partner with other third parties. You know what I mean? Municipalities, entrepreneurial hubs, um, or even companies, right? That have capital that they want to deploy in these areas around our mission. What we want to be able to do is partner with them as a fund management resource to help them um, deploy that infrastructure using our infrastructure, quite frankly, our underwriting and our servicing infrastructure to be able to do that, right? Next, we talk a little bit about capital conversion and pipeline, right, and what that looks like. Um, then I want to talk a little bit about fund management priority, right? So again, you're getting closer to these listing out these priorities. Um, but since we had to write off a sizable bad debt, we want to look at some things, right? How we increase our risk rating, how we're monitoring delinquencies. Our portfolio manager, she does a tremendous job in these areas. Our post loan closing monitoring, that's part of that technical assistance, making sure we have the adequate loan loss reserve, and make sure we've got the portfolio reporting, things of that nature, right? And so you can see what the message is down here. I talked a little bit about fund management, so I'm not going to belabor that, but that's a earned revenue opportunity. Again, as I mentioned, where we don't always have to be balance sheet lenders, right? So that we can lend off balance sheet as well with other partners, chambers, things like that. Not just here in Memphis, but across West Tennessee and even into Middle Tennessee, in the Nashville area, sort of coming back to us here in Memphis. Right. So it's an opportunity for us to move capital. Again, do it off balance sheet where there's not necessarily the balance sheet or interest rate risk to us, but it creates a revenue stream for us. I just talked a little bit about growth, right? So geographic growth across West Tennessee and Middle Tennessee. We're currently working on a fund management opportunity in Nashville around historical Jefferson Street. Um, and we've got some interest in Clarksville. We've got some interest in Jackson, Tennessee. And so we're continuing to work in those areas. And I think those are models where we could go and connect. We're not going there to open up offices and just start lending to everybody. We're not there to give away candy, right? Um, but it's a great way that we could go in with our partners and add, again, that infrastructure that they may not have. All right. So now let's get to sort of the meat of this, right? Operating priorities. So when we talked a little bit about sort of difference between planning and execution, right? A lot of times planning is the decided direction. Execution is turning that direction into motion, right? Turning it into movement. And so a lot of organizations, they're challenged in their strategic planning because either their plan is too broad, nobody owns the work. That's always a challenge. That was a challenge we had early on. A lot of times is we'd have strategic plans, but then no one owns the work, right? Or it's concentrated into one person. Meetings become disconnected from the strategy. So that's another area. People confuse activity with progress. That's a big one. We'll probably talk about that here in the room. The priorities are not clear, right? So it's not clear what we're trying to achieve, why we're trying to achieve it, and what's the impact outcome when we do achieve it, right? And so those are things that you want to think about. So we want to have clear sort of priorities, right? So one is to convert capital. I mentioned earlier a goal of 4 million, stretch goal of 5. We want to deploy responsibly. Remember what I talked about who our avatar is, right? Who are we lending to, right? And what sort of wraparound credit enhancement services are we providing? 3, strengthen the portfolio quality, right? Thinking about that borrower support, loan loss discipline, portfolio monitoring, risk rating, all those type of things. You heard me talk about growing earned revenue, right? So building fund management, how we're originating, how we're servicing, and some of the technical assistance revenue. So we're not just relying on grants. which I talked about at the Alliance conference here just a couple weeks ago in New Orleans, where I led a session about beyond grants. And so you guys can check that out on YouTube. But so I've got that out there. And then expand strategically, right? That's the fifth one. So we've got five sort of core operating priorities for this fiscal year, right? All right. So then the other thing is we talked about with a good strategic plan, how are you measuring success, right? So these are the measures here, bullet pointed. I'm not going to belabor by going all the way through that, but obviously achieving the capital goal, right? So when you achieve a conversion of capital, right, what does that mean? That strengthens our balance sheet, that gives us the resource commitments to execute what we do. Um, disciplined funder pipeline and conversion process, clear reporting, right? Um, improve portfolio monitoring, a more practical strategy on growth and expansion, and really a clear story, right, for investor funders, our board, and our strategic partners. So that's what we're thinking about when we think about what is success. What do we really measure? So now, before I get to final thoughts, one of the things I know we'll talk about here in the room is sort of three strategic questions that um, really go into, and I'm actually going to jot them down here at the end, so you guys can see them. Um, so there's three questions, right, that we want to answer. At least I want to answer in meetings, right? I don't like long drawn out, meetings of this. We're going to be doing this and that, and all this idealization, right? There's three questions we want to answer. One, the first question is, what could we do, right? That's the first thing we want to answer. That is a possibilities question. That's an ideation question, right? So the first thing, and shout out to our managing director of grants, Michael Callum. This is really something I actually learned from him on our team that I've really taken, and I think is a great way to structure meetings. So we start out with jotting down and everybody participating in what could we do, right? So let's explore all the possible opportunities. What are the market opportunities? What are the partnership opportunities? What could we do, right? Given that if we had unlimited time, unlimited resources, unlimited knowledge, right? What could we do, right? So this is designed to be broad. It's designed to be open. It's designed to be exploratory, right? This is where your imagination comes into play, right? But you can't stay here, right? So now what? So after you've jotted down everything that you could do, the next question is, what should we do? Right? So now this is now getting into discipline, right? So now we've listed everything that we could do. What should we do? Right? And so what should we do is what fits the mission, right? Now you're bringing back in the guardrails, right? We have limited resources, we have limited time, we have limited expertise, right? And we have to keep the main thing, right? We're not going to be able to be everything to everybody. What should we do, right? So this is um, this is where the strategy begins to live, right? And this is where you tie possibility to priority, right? So what fits the mission? What is our capacity? What's the strongest use case? How will we create meaningful results? What deserves focus now versus later? What aligns with our risk tolerance, our timing, and our resources, right? So this is where you begin trimming down the what could we do list and the what should we do list. Now we get to the main event happens, right? This is what separates organizations, right? What will we do? Right? So we started with what could we do? What should we do? Now it's what will we do? You know what I'm saying? What will we do? What specific actions are we taking? Who owns the action? What is the timeline? What is the milestones? Um, what meetings will track it, right? And what metrics show progress, right? And so this is where you get away from brainstorming, right? You've already done that in the what could we do, what should we do, right? Now you're going into, now you have to decide, right? What's our priority by when? So execution really begins when the conversation turns from all the options to ownership, right? So once you start assigning names with timelines, right, that's where that sort of takes place. So these are the three areas right here that I like to look at when having meetings, right? And so then once you complete the what will we do, now you have sort of the priorities, the next steps, and the tactics, and you're moving forward, right? And then when you come back for the subsequent meetings, you're going right back to, okay, where are we? What could we do? What should we do? What will we do? Right. And so you've got to be able to create the accountability. You've got to clarify the next steps. You got to keep priorities visible. So one of the things I'm going to do is have up those five priorities that I mentioned earlier, right? These five here, they need to be up visibly. So we're all looking at them. We see them every day. We're talking about this in our meetings. So you have to keep those main things the main things, right? So this is, what we talk about from at least River City Capital's strategic plan. I think it's pretty good, right? We're still keeping it high level. This is not getting into all, what you don't want your strategic plan to be is 100 pages of every single individual tactic and things like that. That comes out in the meetings, right? That comes out when you start getting into the what could we do, what should we do, what will we do, right? So think about that. I know we're having a conversation in the room. We're having a conversation in some of these other spaces, but this is what I wanted to share with you around strategic planning. So we can get into questions, we can get into thoughts, ideas, but hopefully this was beneficial to you. Peace.